Welcome to another journey through history, where we'll explore the intricate world of Victorian social rules together. Tonight, we'll step back into an era where every movement, every word, and every glance carried weight and meaning. An age where propriety wasn't simply preferred, it was the invisible architecture that held society together, and sometimes threatened to crush those who lived within its confines. As you settle into comfort, imagine yourself transported to a time when the simple act of entering a room hired careful choreography, when the wrong fork could spell social disaster, and when the length of a morning dress determined how the world would judge your character. This was the Victorian era, a time of remarkable progress and suffocating convention, where industrial revolution marched alongside social restriction. Tonight, we'll walk through the drawing rooms and servants' halls, the ballrooms and back parlors of this fascinating period. We'll meet those who shaped these rules, those who lived by them, and those who dared to bend them. So let yourself drift into the gaslit world of the 1800s, where manners were armor, etiquette was everything, and a single misstep could echo through a lifetime. Imagine yourself stirring to consciousness in a Victorian bedroom, where the first rays of daylight seep through layers of thick brocade curtains. The air holds a particular quality, cool, slightly damp, scented with the lingering traces of coal smoke and lavender water. But before you can fully appreciate these morning sensations, the weight of the day ahead settles upon you, familiar burden. Today, like every day, will be a careful dance of propriety, where each step must be measured and every gesture weighed. The ritual of becoming presentable begins in the dim light of early morning. If you are a lady of respectable standing, you cannot simply rise and dress yourself. Such independence would be unseemly. Your lady's maid enters quietly, carrying hot water in a china pitcher, her own appearance immaculate despite the early hour. She, too, understands that her presentation reflects upon the household's respectability. The morning toilette unfolds with methodical precision. First comes the washing, a careful process with soft cloths and rose-scented soap, performed with modesty, even in the privacy of your chamber. Then begins the architecture of respectability, the chemise of finest cotton, the drawers tied at the waist, the corset that will reshape your natural form into society's ideal. The stays press against your ribs as the maid draws the laces tight, creating that coveted 18-inch waist that speaks of refinement and moral discipline. Layer upon layer accumulates a bustle to achieve the proper silhouette. Petticoats that rustle with each movement like whispered secrets, stockings of silk or fine cotton held by ribbon garters. Finally comes the dress itself, its fabric chosen not merely for beauty, but for the messages it conveys. Modest in neckline, appropriate in color, immaculate in condition. Every fold speaks of prosperity, every pleat suggests propriety. For the gentleman of the house, the morning transformation proves equally elaborate. The starched collar stands so high and rigid that comfortable movement becomes impossible. Comfort, after all, suggests a lack of proper dedication to appearance. The shirt front gleams white as fresh snow, every pleat pressed to mathematical precision. The cravat requires 20 minutes to arrange properly, its folds and pin positioned according to the latest fashion plates from London. Your morning coat fits without a wrinkle, tailored to suggest prosperity without ostentation. Each button carries meaning, the bottom of the waistcoat left unfastened, the sleeves showing precisely the correct measure of shirt cuff beneath. Even your boots demand attention, polished to mirror brightness, laced with geometric precision, heels clicking against floorboards with the confident rhythm of a man secure in his social position. The descent to the breakfast room becomes a procession of careful dignity. Your footsteps announce your approach to the servants, who have been preparing since before dawn to ensure every detail meets your standards. The butler stands ready, his own appearance a reflection of your household's respectability. The parlour-maid curtsies as you pass, her gesture performed with the exact degree of deference appropriate to her station and yours. In the dining room, morning light filters through lace curtains onto a scene of quiet prosperity. The table gleams with polished silver and pristine china, each piece positioned according to time-honored custom. The morning newspaper rests beside your plate, its pages holding the wider world at a respectful distance. But even this simple act of reading our social consciousness, certain news remains unsuitable for mixed company, certain advertisements too vulgar for respectable acknowledgement. The breakfast itself unfolds, according to unwritten rules, more complex than any legal code. You must eat with measured pace, neither rushing like a tradesman late for business, nor lingering like someone without proper occupation. The cutlery becomes an extension of your moral character. The knife held correctly, the fork employed with precision, each piece returned to its proper position when conversation requires your attention. Even casual remarks carry weight in this morning atmosphere. The weather may be discussed, but not in excessive detail. Plans for the day warrant mention, but without unseemly enthusiasm. Personal comfort or discomfort remains unspoken. A lady never admits to physical sensations. A gentleman never suggests that propriety causes him inconvenience. As the meal progresses, you become aware of the invisible choreography that governs every moment. When to speak, when to remain silent, how to fold your napkin, where to direct your gaze. Each choice echoes through the household hierarchy, influencing how servants perceive your authority, how your family understands their roles, how the wider community will judge your worthiness for their continued acceptance. The morning concludes not with relaxation, but with preparation for greater challenges ahead. Letters await answering, each requiring careful consideration of tone and content. Callers may arrive, demanding flawless performance in the delicate arts of conversation and hospitality. Public appearances loom, where your every gesture will be observed and evaluated by neighbors whose own social standing depends partly on their ability to identify and exclude those who fall short of community standards. Throughout these morning hours, you move within an invisible framework as rigid as the corset stays that shape your silhouette. The rules governing behavior were never formally taught, they simply exist, absorbed through observation and reinforced by the constant possibility of social failure. To violate them means not just personal embarrassment, but potential exile from the very community that gives your life meaning and structure. By the time morning fades into the broader day, you have already performed dozens of small rituals that affirm your place in Victorian society's carefully ordered world. Each successful gesture represents a small victory against the chaos that lurks beyond respectability's boundaries. Each potential misstep avoided is another day's security in a social position that, despite all appearances of solidity, remains as fragile as the china teacups that grace your breakfast table. To understand how deeply these social rules penetrated Victorian life, let us follow the path of one woman whose very existence became the template for an entire age of propriety. Picture Queen Victoria herself, a small figure who cast an enormous shadow across decades of human behavior, whose personal choices became the moral architecture of an empire. Imagine Victoria as a young woman, ascending to the throne in 1837 at the tender age of 18. She inherited not just a crown, but the weight of expectation from a nation hungry for moral leadership after the excesses of her predecessor kings. The Georgian era had been marked by scandal, extravagance, and royal behavior that shocked even the most permissive sensibilities. Victoria would become something entirely different, the embodiment of respectability itself, transforming personal virtue into public policy. In her early years, observe how she navigated the peculiar challenges of being both a queen and a woman in an age when these roles seemed to contradict each other. As monarch, she wielded absolute authority. As a female, society expected her to defer to masculine wisdom. Watch her solve this contradiction through an elaborate performance of propriety that made her authority appear natural, even inevitable. She became powerful by appearing powerless, commanding by seeming to submit to the very moral codes she was simultaneously creating. When Victoria married Prince Albert in 1840, witness how their union became a carefully orchestrated display of ideal domesticity. Their wedding was not merely a state occasion, but a moral statement here, was how marriage should be conducted, how husbands and wives should relate to each other, how families should function. Albert, with his German precision and scholarly inclinations, provided the intellectual framework for what would become Victorian moral philosophy. Together, they created a template of married life that emphasized duty, faithfulness, and careful attention to appearances. Picture their daily routine at Windsor Castle or Osborne House, where every moment was structured according to principles of moral improvement and social example. They rose early, breakfasted together while discussing the day's obligations, spent their mornings in separate but parallel work, he with his secretaries and government ministers, she with her ladies-in-waiting and correspondence. Luncheon brought them together again, followed by afternoon walks where even their leisure appeared purposeful, educational. Their evenings unfolded with the measured rhythm of ideal domesticity. Albert might read aloud while Victoria worked at her needlework, or they would examine plans for moral improvement projects, the construction of model housing for workers, the establishment of educational institutions, the patronage of arts that elevated rather than merely entertained. Even their entertainments served didactic purposes. When they hosted musical evenings, the selections emphasized classical composers over popular songs, moral themes over romantic indulgences. Watch how Victoria's personal tastes became national mandates through the mysterious process by which royal preference transforms into social law. She favored dark colors, deep blues, rich purples, forest greens, and suddenly the bright, frivolous pastels of earlier decades appeared vulgar, inappropriate. Her preference for elaborate mourning rituals, initially a personal response to the death of her mother and other close relatives, evolved into a comprehensive philosophy of grief that would reshape how an entire culture processed loss and remembrance. But it was Albert's death in 1861 that truly revealed the power of Victoria's moral influence. Imagine the 42-year-old Queen, devastated by the loss of her beloved companion, retreating into an elaborate ritual of perpetual mourning that would last for the remaining 40 years of her life. She ordered that Albert's rooms remain exactly as he had left them, his clothes laid out each morning, his water brought for shaving, as if he might return at any moment. This private grief, conducted with such theatrical precision, became a public lesson in the proper relationship between love and loss. Victoria's mourning dress, the heavy black silk that rustled with each movement, the jet jewelry that caught the light without sparkling, the widow's cap that framed her face like a declaration of permanent sorrow, became the uniform of an age. Observe how her personal choice to wear black transformed the entire fashion industry. Suddenly, clothing manufacturers scrambled to produce the perfect mourning attire, jewelers specialized in the somber elegance of jet and onyx, and milliners crafted veils that would properly express grief without completely obscuring visibility. The rules that emerged from Victoria's mourning were as complex as any legal code. Full mourning required 18 months of unrelieved black, followed by 6 months of half mourning where purple, grey, or lavender might be gradually introduced. The depth of one's relationship to the deceased determined the length and intensity of observance. A widow mourned longer than a sister, a mother longer than a cousin. Each stage of mourning came with its own restrictions. No social visits during full mourning, no dancing, no bright colors, no jewelry except jet or hair ornaments crafted from the deceased's own locks. Picture the elaborate industry that grew around these mourning requirements. Shops specialized entirely in mourning goods, their windows draped in black silk, their interiors hushed like chapels. Seamstresses worked through the night creating the extensive wardrobe required for proper grief: black dresses for every occasion, black undergarments, black accessories, black-edged handkerchiefs, black-bordered stationery. Even children had their mourning clothes, scaled-down versions of adult grief that taught them from the earliest ages that death was serious business, requiring serious responses. But Victoria's influence extended far beyond the rituals of mourning. Watch how her rigid standards of sexual propriety reshaped the entire landscape of human relationships. The Queen's horror at any suggestion of impropriety between unmarried persons created a culture of elaborate chaperoning that made spontaneous romance nearly impossible. Young women could not be alone with young men. Married women must be careful of their friendships with men other than their husbands. And even married couples were expected to conduct themselves with restraint that suggested passion was somewhat unseemly, even within the bonds of matrimony. Consider the case of Lady Flora Hastings, one of Victoria's ladies-in-waiting, whose swollen abdomen in 1839 led to whispers of illegitimate pregnancy. The Queen's immediate assumption of guilt, her refusal to accept medical evidence of the lady's innocence, and her persistent coldness even after Lady Flora's death from liver disease, revealed the harsh reality of life under Victoria's moral microscope. One hint of scandal could destroy a reputation instantly, and even proven innocence might not restore what suspicion had damaged. Observe how Victoria's court became a laboratory for the development of social rules that would spread throughout British society and across the empire. The precise hierarchies of precedence that governed who entered a room first, who spoke before whom, who could sit in the royal presence, all filtered down through the ranks of society until every drawing room in England operated according to similar principles. The Queen's own rigid adherence to protocol, her insistence that even her closest friends observe proper forms of address, her careful attention to dress codes and social rankings created a culture where informality became almost treasonous. Picture a typical day at court during Victoria's reign, where every interaction was choreographed according to rules that seemed to multiply with each passing year. Ladies-in-waiting dressed according to strict guidelines, their colours coordinating with the Queen's own selections, their jewellery appropriate to their rank and the formality of the occasion. Gentlemen appeared in uniform, all court dress, their decorations polished to perfection, their behaviour restrained to the point of near paralysis. Even conversation at court followed prescribed patterns. Certain topics were forbidden entirely. Anything that might remind the Queen of her loss, anything that suggested criticism of her policies, anything that hinted at impropriety or scandal. Weather remained safe, as did inquiries about health, but even these innocent subjects required careful navigation. Too much concern about someone's welfare and suggest improper interest. Too little might appear callous. The Queen's own daily routine became a model that ambitious families throughout Britain attempted to emulate. Victoria rose early, dressed with careful attention to appropriateness rather than fashion, breakfasted simply, then devoted her morning hours to correspondence and official duties. Her afternoons included carefully supervised recreation walks that provided exercise without appearing frivolous, drives that offered fresh air without suggesting pleasure-seeking. Her evenings were spent in improving activities, reading histories or biographies rather than novels, examining reports on charitable institutions rather than society gossip, engaging in needlework that produced useful items rather than mere decoration. Watch how Victoria's personal relationships became templates for entire categories of human interaction. Her devotion to Albert during their marriage established the Victorian ideal of companionate marriage not merely an economic or social arrangement, but a partnership based on shared moral purpose and mutual improvement. Their correspondence, much of which has survived, reveals to people constantly encouraging each other toward higher standards of conduct, greater attention to duty, more perfect self-control. After Albert's death, Victoria's relationships with her servants and advisors demonstrated the proper boundaries between different social ranks. John Brown, the Scottish servant who became her companion and protector, occupied a unique position that scandalized some observers, but Victoria's careful preservation of appropriate distance, even within intimacy, showed how personal affection could coexist with social hierarchy. Their relationship, whatever its private dimensions, was conducted with sufficient attention to public propriety that it survived decades of scrutiny. The Queen's relationships with her own children provided another model for family dynamics throughout the realm. Observe her correspondence with her daughters, filled with detailed instructions about proper behavior, appropriate marriages, and the maintenance of moral standards. When her eldest daughter Vicky married the Prussian crown prince and moved to Germany, Victoria's letters followed her across Europe, filled with reminders about deportment, warnings about foreign influences, and expectations that English standards of propriety would be maintained even in alien courts. Victoria's treatment of her sons revealed the particular challenges of raising young men to Victorian standards. The Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, consistently disappointed his mother with behaviour she considered frivolous, self-indulgent, and morally suspect. His enjoyment of society parties, his friendships with people Victoria considered unsuitable, his apparent preference for pleasure over duty, all became sources of ongoing conflict that demonstrated the difficulty of maintaining Victorian standards across generations. Picture the elaborate mechanisms Victoria created to ensure that moral standards were maintained throughout her court and, by extension, throughout British society. She appointed ladies-in-waiting who shared her commitment to propriety, gentlemen-in-waiting who understood the importance of setting good examples, and advisors who could translate her personal preferences into public policies. Her annual movements between residences from Windsor to Balmoral to Osborne House became opportunities to demonstrate proper domestic arrangements, efficient household management, and the appropriate relationship between private comfort and public responsibility. The Queen's attention to detail in matters of protocol was legendary. She personally approved the guest lists for court functions, ensuring that no one with questionable reputation access to royal circles. She scrutinized the dress and behavior of everyone presented to her, making mental notes that could affect future invitations and social standing. Her memory for social slights and breaches of etiquette was prodigious. A carelessly worded remark or an inappropriate gesture might result in years of royal displeasure. Witness how Victoria's influence extended beyond Britain's shores through the vast network of colonial administrators, military officers, and missionaries who carried British standards of propriety to every corner of the empire. Her own attention to moral improvement projects, from model housing for workers to educational institutions for the poor, created a template for benevolent imperialism that justified British rule as moral uplift rather than mere political domination. The Queen's later years, as she emerged slowly from the deepest period of mourning, demonstrated how personal transformation could become social evolution. Her gradual return to public ceremonies, her acceptance of limited social obligations, her eventual willingness to appear at Jubilee celebrations, all provided lessons in how grief should be processed, how duty should triumph over personal preference, how individual healing could serve the greater good. By the time of Victoria's death in 1901, she had lived long enough to see her personal moral code become the defining characteristic of an entire historical period. The woman who had begun her reign as a young girl uncertain of her authority had become the moral arbiter of an empire, the living embodiment of values that shaped everything from family relationships to international diplomacy. Her funeral, conducted with unprecedented attention to protocol and propriety, marked the end of an era defined by the belief that individual behavior could be perfected through constant attention to moral rules and social expectations. But perhaps Victoria's most lasting influence lay in her demonstration that moral authority could be more powerful than political force, that personal example could shape public behavior more effectively than laws or punishments. Through the simple act of living according to her own rigorous standards, she created a cultural climate where respectability became the highest aspiration, where social acceptance required constant vigilance against moral failure, and where the price of belonging to proper society was the willingness to subordinate personal desires to collective expectations of appropriate behavior. The Victorian age, shaped so profoundly by this small, determined woman, would outlast her own lifetime by decades. Even today, we speak of Victorian values as shorthand for sexual restraint, social hierarchy, and the belief that proper behavior can be learned, practiced, and perfected. Victoria's legacy was not just political or economic, but fundamentally moral, the creation of a worldview that made personal virtue into public policy, individual propriety into social law, and private discipline into the foundation of imperial confidence. Deep in the archives of country houses and city museums, archaeologists of social history have uncovered a treasure trove of artifacts that reveal just how elaborate and mysterious the web of Victorian social rules truly was. These objects, calling cards yellowed with age, gloves carefully preserved in tissue paper, dance cards with their tiny pencils still attached, whisper stories of a civilization as complex and ritualized as any ancient culture we might excavate from buried cities. Picture yourself examining a collection of calling cards discovered in the writing desk of a Victorian lady's morning room. Each card is a small work of art, engraved on heavy cream paper with the finest of script. But these are not mere announcements of identity, they are coded messages, their very design and presentation carrying information as precisely calibrated as diplomatic communications. Notice the subtle variations that spoke volumes to their original recipients. The thickness of the cardstock announced the caller's economic status, thin paper suggested financial constraints, while heavy, richly textured cards indicated prosperity. The style of engraving revealed taste and education. Simple, elegant fonts suggested refinement, while elaborate flourishes might indicate nouveau rich pretensions. The size of the cards followed strict protocols. A gentleman's card measured exactly 3.5 by 2.5 inches, while a lady's card was slightly smaller, more delicate, befitting her supposedly more fragile nature. But the true mystery lay in how these cards were used. Imagine the intricate choreography surrounding their presentation. A caller would arrive at a house and present their card to the butler, who would examine it with the trained eye of a diplomat. If the lady of the house was receiving, the card would be returned to indicate acceptance. If she was not at home, that useful fiction that preserved everyone's dignity, the card would be retained, acknowledging the visit while deferring the social interaction. The timing of these visits followed rules as precise as astronomical calculations. Morning calls took place between 11 and 1 o'clock, afternoon visits between 3 and 6. To arrive outside these hours marked one as ignorant of proper forms, possibly unsuitable for future invitations. The duration of visits was equally regulated, never less than 15 minutes, lest it appear perfunctory, never more than 30, lest it suggest an inability to read social cues or, worse, a presumption upon hospitality. Consider the archaeological evidence found in Victorian ladies' writing desks, calling card cases made of silver, mother of pearl, or tortoise shell, their surfaces worn smooth by constant handling. Inside these cases, cards were arranged according to complex hierarchies. Those of the most important acquaintances occupied the front compartments, while cards from lesser social connections were relegated to the back. Some cases included separate sections for different categories of cards, those to be left when paying condolence calls, those appropriate for congratulations, those used for formal invitations. The mystery deepens when we examine the elaborate language that developed around these social objects. Folding corners of calling cards in different ways conveyed specific messages. The upper right corner turned down indicated a personal visit, rather than one made by a servant. The upper left corner folded suggested condolence or sympathy. The lower right corner meant goodbye or farewell, often used when leaving town for an extended period. The lower left corner indicated congratulations. These silent communications allowed Victorian society to conduct complex social business without ever speaking directly about delicate matters. Archaeologists have discovered entire libraries of etiquette manuals that reveal the obsessive attention Victorians paid to the minutiae of social interaction. These books, found dusty and forgotten in attics and estate sales, contain instructions so detailed they rival military field manuals in their precision. Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, published in 1861, devoted hundreds of pages to the proper conduct of social visits, the arrangement of dinner parties, the selection of appropriate gifts for different occasions. But perhaps more revealing of the personal letters and diary entries that have survived, offering glimpses into how these rules affected real lives. In the papers of Lady Catherine Pemberton, discovered during the restoration of a Yorkshire manor house, we find detailed accounts of social anxiety that would be familiar to any modern reader. I spent the entire morning worried that my card case contained the wrong sort of cards for afternoon calls. She writes in 1867, the thought that I might present a morning card during afternoon hours quite paralyzed me with dread. The archaeological record reveals objects whose very existence testifies to the complexity of Victorian social life. Glove stretchers, found in bedroom dressers throughout Britain, speak to the importance of perfectly fitted gloves in an age when exposed hands were considered almost indecent. These wooden forms were adjusted to maintain glove shape and prevent wrinkles, for wrinkled gloves marked their wearers careless or, worse, impoverished. Consider the mystery of Victorian parasols, found carefully preserved in hallway stands and bedroom closets. These were not merely sun protection, but sophisticated social instruments. The way a lady carried her parasol, the angle at which she held it, the manner in which she opened and closed it, all conveyed messages to observant watchers. A parasol carried over the right shoulder meant follow me, while one over the left shoulder suggested I wish to speak with you. Opening and closing a parasol quickly indicated impatience or displeasure. Twirling a parasol meant the lady wished to be left alone. The archaeology of Victorian mourning reveals perhaps the most elaborate system of social rules ever developed around the universal human experience of grief. Museum collections contain entire wardrobes of mourning clothes, each piece representing a different stage, the carefully choreographed process of public grieving. Full mourning required dull black fabrics that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, no silk that might shimmer, no buttons that might catch the eye, no ornamentation that might suggest vanity persisting despite loss. Examine the jewelry found in Victorian estate collections, brooches made from hair of the deceased, rings containing miniature photographs surrounded by seed pearls representing tears, lockets designed to hold locks of hair or tiny portraits. These objects reveal a culture that refused to allow grief to remain private, instead transforming personal sorrow into public performance, individual loss into social ritual. The mystery of Victorian mourning extends to its temporal precision. Mourning periods were calculated with mathematical exactness: 2 years for a spouse, 1 year for a parent, 6 months for a grandparent, 3 months for a great-aunt, 6 weeks for a first cousin. Each period brought its own requirements for dress, behavior, and social participation. Widows in deep mourning could not attend parties, could not wear colors, could not listen to music or engage in any activity that might suggest the persistence of joy despite their loss. But archaeological evidence also reveals the hidden rebellion against these rigid rules. In private letters and personal objects, we find evidence of how people adapted, subverted, or simply endured the weight of constant social surveillance. Secret pockets sewn into mourning dresses contained brightly colored handkerchiefs or small personal tokens. Jewelry boxes held pieces that were never worn in public but treasured in private colorful brooches, delicate chains, rings set with cheerful stones that waited patiently for the mourning period to end. The cultural mystery deepens when we examine how these elaborate social rules served functions beyond mere propriety. The calling card system, for instance, created a complex network of social information that allowed Victorian society to regulate itself without formal institutions. By tracking who visited whom, when, and under what circumstances, communities could monitor social relationships, identify potential scandals, and enforce standards of behavior through inclusion or exclusion. Consider the dance cards, found in the trunks of Victorian young ladies, small booklets with tiny pencils attached by silk cords, each page representing a different dance at a formal ball. These seemingly innocent objects reveal the intricate mathematics of Victorian courtship. A young lady's dance card served as a public record of her popularity and social standing. To have too many empty spaces suggested unpopularity. to be completely filled too early in the evening suggested either exceptional desirability or, more dangerously, a reputation for being fast or forward. The rules governing these dance cards were extraordinarily complex. A young lady could not dance more than twice with the same gentleman without suggesting improper interest. She could not refuse one partner and then accept another for the same dance without causing offense. She must never appear to be saving dances for particular partners, yet she must also avoid the appearance of dancing with anyone who asked. The successful navigation of these contradictory requirements required social skills as sophisticated as any diplomatic negotiation. Archaeological evidence from Victorian homes reveals the elaborate infrastructure required to maintain proper social standards. Butlers' pantries contained specialized equipment for the care and presentation of calling cards, invitation responses, and social correspondence. Silver salvers were designated specifically for receiving cards, their surfaces kept polished to mirror brightness. Writing desks included multiple compartments for different types of stationery, morning paper with black borders, congratulatory cards with gold edges, everyday correspondence in appropriate cream or ivory tones. The mystery of Victorian gift-giving reveals another layer of social complexity. Museum collections contain thousands of small objects that seem insignificant to modern eyes, but carried precise social meanings in their original context. Handkerchiefs embroidered with specific patterns, books inscribed with carefully chosen quotations, flowers pressed between the pages of poetry volumes, each represented a form of communication as structured as written language. The language of flowers, or florography, created an entire vocabulary of sentiment that allowed Victorians to express feelings that could not be spoken directly. Red roses meant passionate love, but pink roses suggested admiration, white roses indicated pure love, and yellow roses meant friendship. Forget-me-nots requested remembrance, while pansies meant thoughts. Ivy represented fidelity, while ferns suggested fascination. A bouquet became a coded message, its meaning accessible to those educated in this botanical language, while remaining mysterious to casual observers. But perhaps the most intriguing archaeological discoveries are the objects that reveal the psychological toll of living under such elaborate social constraints. Private diaries describe the exhaustion of maintaining constant vigilance against social missteps. Personal letters reveal the anxiety that accompanied every social interaction, the fear that a single mistake results in social ostracism or damaged reputation. In the papers of Miss Adelaide Thornfield, found during the demolition of a London townhouse, we discover this poignant entry from 1884. I find myself so tired from the effort of being constantly appropriate that I sometimes long to be ill, simply for the relief of being excused from social obligations. To lie in bed and receive sympathy seems infinitely preferable to sitting in drawing rooms and calculating the correct response to every comment, the proper reaction to every situation. The archaeological record also reveals how different social classes adapted these rules to their own circumstances and limitations. Working-class families could not afford the elaborate mourning costumes required by upper-class standards, so they developed their own modified versions: black armbands for men, black bonnets for women, simple tokens that acknowledged loss without requiring financial sacrifice. Middle-class families invested heavily in the objects required for proper social performance, often at considerable economic strain, because the appearance of gentility was essential to their social aspirations. The mystery extends to the regional variations in social rules that archaeological evidence has revealed. Provincial families maintained slightly different standards from London society, creating a complex geography of propriety where rules shifted subtly depending on location. Scottish traditions modified English customs, Irish practices added their own variations, and colonial societies developed hybrid forms that attempted to maintain British standards under alien conditions. Consider the surviving evidence of Victorian children's social education miniature calling cards found in nurseries, toity sets designed to teach proper serving techniques, games that instructed players in the complexities of social precedents. These objects reveal how thoroughly Victorian society intended to perpetuate its values, beginning the process of social education almost from birth. The cultural archaeology of Victorian society was a civilization that had transformed social interaction into an art form as complex and demanding as any religious ritual. Every gesture carried meaning, every object served multiple social functions, and every interaction required careful calculation of appropriate response. The Victorian achievement was to create a system of social organization so elaborate and comprehensive that it governed not just public behavior, but private thought, not just special occasions, but daily routine, not just adult interactions, but the entire process of human development from childhood to old age. Yet the mystery remains: how did a society sustain such elaborate attention to social detail? What psychological and cultural forces made it possible for entire generations to accept the burden of constant social performance? The objects they left behind suggest both the benefits and costs of this system, the security that came from knowing exactly how to behave in any situation, balanced against the exhaustion of never being able to simply be oneself without calculation, performance, and constant attention to the judgment of others. The archaeological evidence suggests that Victorian social rules served multiple functions simultaneously. They provided order and predictability in a rapidly changing world. They created mechanisms for social mobility while preserving existing hierarchies. They channeled potentially disruptive emotions and desires into socially acceptable forms. And they created a shared culture that could unite people across vast geographic and economic differences. But they also created a society where authenticity became almost impossible, where spontaneity was suspect, and where the price of social acceptance was the subordination of individual desire to collective expectation. To truly understand the weight of Victorian social rules, we must journey across the vast landscape of class distinction, where the same fundamental principles of propriety took radically different forms, depending on one's position in society's carefully constructed hierarchy. Picture three worlds existing simultaneously within the same cities, the same neighborhoods, sometimes even within the same buildings, each governed by the same underlying obsession with proper behavior, yet each expressing that obsession in ways that revealed the profound inequalities of Victorian life. Begin with the aristocratic world, where social rules reached their most elaborate and refined expression. Imagine yourself in the drawing room of a great country estate, Chatsworth, perhaps, or Blenheim Palace, where the morning light filters through windows that have looked out upon manicured landscapes for centuries. Here, the rules of propriety are not burdens to be borne, but privileges to be exercised, markers of a superiority so deeply embedded in the social order that it requires no justification, only endless refinement. The Duke and Duchess who inhabit this world move through their days, surrounded by an army of servants whose entire existence is dedicated to maintaining the illusion that aristocratic life unfolds effortlessly, naturally, without the crude necessities of work or worrying that burden lesser mortals. Watch as the Duchess awakens in a bedroom where her personal maid has already laid out the day's clothing, selected according to a complex calculus of weather, schedule, and social obligations. The choice between the blue silk morning dress and the green wool walking costume is not merely aesthetic, but deeply political, announcing to all who encounter her the exact nature of her day's activities and her attitude toward them. Picture the elaborate choreography of an aristocratic breakfast, where even the most intimate family meal becomes a performance of social hierarchy. The Duke enters first, followed by the Duchess, then any adult children in order of their birth and gender, sons before daughters, elder before younger. Servants move around the table with practiced silence, anticipating needs before they are expressed, their very invisibility a mark of their training and the family's status. The conversation flows according to unspoken rules. The Duke may discuss politics or estate business. The Duchess responds with appropriate interest, while introducing topics deemed suitable for feminine attention. and the children speak only when addressed directly. But observe how even this privileged world is constrained by rules as binding as any prison. The Duke cannot simply do as he pleases. His position comes with obligations that govern every aspect of his existence. He must marry appropriately, manage his estates responsibly, maintain his family's political influence, and present himself as a worthy representative of aristocratic values. His pleasures must be conducted discreetly, his business affairs managed honorably, his public appearances choreographed to reinforce rather than undermine the social order that sustains his position. The Duchess faces even more elaborate constraints, her every public appearance scrutinized for evidence of appropriate feminine virtue. She must be beautiful, but not vain, intelligent, but not intellectual, charitable, but not political, influential, but never obviously powerful. Her clothing must be expensive enough to demonstrate her status, but never so fashionable as to suggest frivolity. Her conversation must be engaging, but never controversial, her opinions firmly held, but expressed with appropriate deference to masculine authority. Now shift your attention to the grand ballroom of this same estate during the social season, when aristocratic society gathers to reinforce its bonds and display its magnificent irrelevance to the crude business of earning money or producing useful goods. Picture hundreds of guests moving through an elaborate dance of precedence and protocol, where every interaction is governed by rules so complex they require lifelong study to master completely. Watch as the guests arrive, their carriages forming a procession that announces the hierarchy of the evening. The most distinguished guests arrive neither first nor last, but at precisely the moment calculated to demonstrate their importance without suggesting eagerness. Their dress represents fortunes spent not merely on fabric and ornamentation, but on the services of designers who understand the subtle language of aristocratic fashion, how to suggest wealth without ostentation, status without vulgarity, tradition without stagnation. The evening unfolds according to a script written by centuries of precedent. Dinner is announced with ceremonial precision, guests proceeding into the dining room according to strict order of rank. The Duke offers his arm to the most distinguished lady present, perhaps a duchess from another family, or a foreign princess, or the wife of a senior government minister. Other couples follow in precise order, each pairing calculated to honor appropriate distinctions while maintaining social harmony. The dining room itself represents the pinnacle of aristocratic theater. Gold plate gleams under crystal chandeliers. Flowers arranged by teams of gardeners create natural beauty that appears effortless, but represents hours of careful planning. The table settings require archaeological precision, each piece of crystal, each item of silverware, positioned according to rules that have evolved over generations. Servants move through the room like dancers, their livery indicating their specific roles, their movements choreographed to serve each course with mathematical precision. Conversation at such gatherings follows patterns as formal as religious liturgy. Political topics may be discussed, but only within bounds that preserve the fiction that aristocrats stand above partisan conflict. Economic matters are approached obliquely, through discussions of estate management or agricultural improvements that avoid any direct acknowledgement that money matters to people of quality. Personal topics are navigated with extraordinary delicacy. Family members are inquired after in ways that invite either full revelation or polite deflection, depending on the speaker's preference. But now, let us descend through the social hierarchy to observe how these same principles of propriety operate in the vastly different world of the middle classes. Picture yourself in the morning room of a prosperous merchant's house in Manchester or Birmingham, where the Industrial Revolution has created unprecedented wealth, alongside unprecedented anxiety about social position. Here, the rules of proper behavior serve not to maintain inherited position, but to claim and defend newly acquired status, to distinguish the successful middle class from both the aristocracy above and the working classes below. The merchant's wife who presides over this household faces challenges unknown to her aristocratic sisters. She must demonstrate gentility, without the natural authority that comes from generations of noble blood. She must display prosperity without suggesting vulgar preoccupation with money. She must maintain social connections without appearing to seek advancement above her proper station. Every choice she makes, from the pattern of her china to the topics of her conversation, must navigate between the Scylla of pretension and the Charybdis of inadequate aspiration. Watch her as she prepares for her weekly at-home day, when friends and neighbors will call to maintain the social networks essential to middle-class life. Her drawing room has been arranged with minute attention to detail, the furniture positioned to encourage proper conversation, the decorations selected to demonstrate refined taste without ostentation, the refreshments planned to suggest gracious hospitality without extravagance. Every element of the room must communicate messages about her family's values, prosperity, and social aspirations. The visitors who arrive during these afternoon hours represent the complex ecosystem of middle-class society. There is Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, whose husband's financial success grants her a position of acknowledged leadership in local social hierarchy. Miss Pemberton, the doctor's unmarried daughter, occupies a delicate position. Her father's profession grants respectability, but her unmarried state and lack of independent wealth creates subtle disadvantages. Mrs. Morrison, married to a successful shopkeeper, hovers at the edges of true respectability, her husband's commercial background marking her as slightly inferior, despite her family's obvious prosperity. The conversation among these ladies follows patterns designed to maintain social harmony while establishing and reinforcing subtle distinctions of status. They discuss their children's education merely to share parental concerns, but to demonstrate their commitment to improvement and their ability to afford proper schooling. They exchange information about household management from mere domestic interest, but to display their knowledge of genteel living and their success in maintaining appropriate standards. They share news of social events not simply as gossip, but as evidence of their integration into respectable society. Picture one of these middle-class families preparing for their annual dinner party, an event that represents months of planning and significant financial investment. Unlike their aristocratic counterparts, they cannot rely on inherited silver, family china, or servants trained from childhood in the elaborate rituals of formal dining. Instead, they must create the appearance of effortless elegance through careful preparation, strategic purchases, and meticulous attention to detail. The wife spends weeks planning the menu, consulting cookbooks and seeking advice from friends about dishes that will impress without appearing pretentious. The husband reviews the guest list repeatedly, ensuring the proper balance of business associates, social equals, and family members. Together, they rehearse the evening's choreography, who will be seated where, how conversation will be guided, when the ladies will withdraw from the dining room to allow the gentlemen their ports and cigars. When the evening arrives, observe the elaborate performance of middle-class social aspiration. The guests arrive in carefully planned sequence, their carriages hired for the occasion, if they do not own their own. Their dress represents significant investment in appropriate formal wear, evening clothes that may be worn only a few times per year, but are essential to maintaining social position. The host and hostess greet each arrival with precisely calibrated warmth, demonstrating their pleasure at the honor of their friends' company, while maintaining the dignity appropriate to their position as evening's leaders. But notice the subtle tensions that underlie even the most successful middle-class social events. There is always the fear that some detail will reveal the effort behind the elegance, that a servant will make a mistake that exposes the family's relative inexperience with grand entertaining, that conversation will turn to topics that highlight rather than obscure the commercial origins of the family's wealth. The middle-class mastery of social rules requires not just knowledge, but constant vigilance, not just performance, but the ability to make that performance appear natural and effortless. Now let us journey to the basement of this same house, or to the narrow streets that surround it, where working-class families navigate their own complex relationship with Victorian social rules. Here, Propriety takes form shaped by economic necessity, community solidarity, and the constant awareness that survival itself depends upon maintaining respectability within severely constrained circumstances. Picture Sarah Murphy, who works as a housemaid in the merchant's house we have just visited. Her day begins before dawn, when she lights the fires that will warm the family's rooms, prepares the water for their washing, and sets in motion the domestic machinery that will create the illusion of effortless comfort for her employers. Her own adherence to social rules must be invisible yet perfect. She must be properly dressed, but never fashionable, efficiently helpful, but never familiar, constantly present, but somehow unnoticed. Watch Sarah as she navigates the elaborate hierarchy of the servants' hall, where social rules operate with the same relentless precision as in the drawing rooms above, but express fundamentally different values and concerns. The butler commands absolute authority over the male servants, the housekeeper governs the female staff, and the cook rules the kitchen with unquestioned sovereignty. Each servant knows their exact position in this hierarchy, their specific duties and limitations, their proper relationships with servants above and below their station. The clothing Sarah wears represents a careful negotiation between respectability and economy. Her work dress must be clean, neat, and appropriate to her station, not so shabby as to reflect poorly on her employers, not so fine as to suggest pretensions above her proper place. Her afternoon dress, worn during her few hours of leisure, represents her personal aspirations: better fabric than her work clothes, more fashionable styling, evidence of her attempts to maintain dignity despite her circumstances. But observe the different social rules that govern Sarah's world when she returns to her own neighborhood, a narrow street of terraced houses where working families maintain their own elaborate codes of respectability. Here, the standards are different, but no less demanding. A woman's reputation depends upon the cleanliness of her front step, the whiteness of her washing hung out to dry, the behavior of her children in the street. A man's standing relies upon his regularity of employment, his sobriety, his ability to provide for his family without requiring parish assistance. Picture the Murphy family's Sunday routine, when working-class respectability finds its fullest expression. The entire family bathes a weekly ritual that requires heating water on the stove and taking turns in the single tin tub that serves the household. Their best clothes are brought out carefully mended, meticulously cleaned, representing a significant portion of the family's annual income. They walk to church in procession, parents leading, children following in order of age, each member of the family presenting themselves for community inspection and evaluation. The church service itself reveals the complex ways in which social rules operate across class boundaries. The same building contains representatives of all social levels, but they are arranged according to strict hierarchy. The aristocratic family occupies the front pew, their position marked by elaborate decorations and comfortable cushions. The middle-class families fill the middle sections, their seating determined by a complex calculus of wealth, profession, and local standing. The working families sit in the back, on hard wooden benches that acknowledge their lower status while still affirming their membership in a community of the respectable. But notice how the same religious service creates both unity and division. All sing the same hymns, hear the same sermon, participate in the same rituals of worship. Yet their participation expresses their different positions in the social hierarchy. The aristocratic families' donations support the church. The middle-class families organize charitable activities. The working families provide the labor that maintains the building and grounds. Even in approaching the same God, Victorian society maintained the distinctions that separated class from class, rank from rank, the privileged from the struggling. Consider now the tragic figure of Mary Collins, a housemaid who has lost her position due to an unfounded accusation of theft. Watch her as she searches for new employment, carrying her character reference a letter from her former employer that will determine her future prospects. Without this crucial document, she cannot obtain respectable employment. With it, She may find another position, but always under the shadow of suspicion that some moral failing led to her dismissal. Mary's situation reveals the cruel reality of how social rules operated for those with the least power to resist them. A single mistake, a moment of bad judgment, a false accusation, could destroy years of careful reputation building. Unlike their social superiors, working people had no inherited status to protect them, no family connections to provide second chances, no financial resources to weather periods of social disgrace. Yet observe how even in these desperate circumstances, the working classes maintain their own versions of social rules, their own standards of appropriate behavior, their own mechanisms for preserving dignity despite economic hardship. Neighbors organized mutual aid societies to help families through crisis. Churches provided not just spiritual comfort, but practical assistance for the deserving poor. Communities created informal networks of support that acknowledged economic vulnerability while maintaining moral standards. Picture a working-class family gathering for a Sunday tea, where the same principles that govern aristocratic dinner parties find expression in simpler, but no less meaningful forms. The table is set with the family's best china, perhaps only a matching set of cups and saucers, but carefully preserved and proudly displayed. The food represents sacrifice and planning: white bread instead of brown, butter instead of margarine, cake purchased specially for the occasion. The conversation follows its own patterns of propriety. Children speak respectfully to their elders. Family news is shared with appropriate concern. Neighborhood gossip is exchanged within bounds of charitable interpretation. The contrast between these three worlds reveals both the universality and the cruel selectivity of Victorian social rules. In every class, people struggled to maintain dignity, to demonstrate respectability, to claim their place in the community of the worthy. But the standards for achieving that respectability varied dramatically according to one's economic circumstances. The consequences of failure fell most heavily upon those with the least power to recover, and the rewards for success were distributed with profound inequality. An aristocratic lady who committed a social error might face temporary embarrassment, but retain her fundamental position. A middle-class woman who violated propriety suffer lasting damage to her family's social aspirations. But a working-class woman who fell from respectability faced potential destitution, homelessness, and social death. The same system that provided comfort and security for some created anxiety and vulnerability for others. The same rules that seemed natural and inevitable to the privileged appeared arbitrary and cruel to those who lacked the resources to fulfill them completely. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Victorian social rules was their ability to create genuine community across these vast inequalities. The same basic values: honesty, hard work, family loyalty, social responsibility found expression in every social class, even if the specific requirements varied dramatically. A shared commitment to respectability created common ground between the Duchess in her drawing room and the housemaid in the servants' hall, between the merchant's wife planning her dinner party and the working mother preparing her family's Sunday tea. This shared moral framework made possible the great social reforms of the Victorian era: the expansion of education, the improvement of working conditions, the development of charitable institutions, because it provided a common language for discussing social problems and a shared sense of obligation to address them. The wealthy felt genuine responsibility for the welfare of their social inferiors, while the poor maintained genuine respect for the leadership of their social superiors, because all participated in the same fundamental belief system about proper behavior and social duty. The Victorian achievement was to create a social system stable enough to survive massive economic and political changes, while flexible enough to accommodate gradual reform and improvement. The price of this stability was the subordination of individual desire to collective expectation, the sacrifice of personal authenticity to social performance, and the acceptance of inequality as the natural and necessary foundation of social order. As the Victorian era drew to its close, these elaborate social rules would face challenges from new ideas about individual freedom, gender equality, and social justice. But for nearly a century, they provided the framework within which millions of people conducted their daily lives, sought meaning and purpose, and understood their place in the vast hierarchical structure of human society. Whether liberating or confining, whether natural or artificial, whether just or cruel, these rules shaped the lived experience of multiple generations and left a legacy that continues to influence how we think about proper behavior, social responsibility, and the relationship between individual desire and collective need. As we reach the end of our journey through the intricate landscape of Victorian social rules, let yourself sink deeper into the quietude of your own time, your own space, where the weight of constant social performance has lifted like morning mist. Feel the relief of living in an age where spontaneity is not suspect, where authenticity need not be hidden beneath layers of calculated propriety, where a single social misstep will not destroy a carefully constructed reputation built over years of vigilant attention to endless rules. Picture yourself now as an observer looking back across more than a century of time, watching as that elaborate world of corsets and calling cards, morning jewelry and dance programs slowly fades into the gentler light of historical memory. The Victorians who populated our story, Queen Victoria herself, with her rigid standards of moral authority, the aristocratic families moving through their choreographed social seasons, the anxious middle-class households striving to demonstrate their respectability, the working families maintaining dignity despite economic hardship, all have become characters in the vast novel of the past, their urgent concerns transformed into the material of quiet contemplation. What remains most striking about that vanished world is not its differences from our own, but the recognizable human desires that drove its elaborate social machinery. The Victorian obsession with proper behavior arose from the same fundamental needs that shape human societies in every age: the longing to belong, the desire for security, the hope that individual effort might be rewarded with social acceptance and personal meaning. Their rules, however elaborate and sometimes cruel, represented attempts to create order from chaos, to establish reliable patterns of behavior that would allow people to navigate complex social relationships with confidence and grace. The tragedy of the Victorian system in its ambition to civilize human behavior, but in its inability to acknowledge the costs of that civilization. The same rules that provided security for some created anxiety for others. The same standards that elevated human interaction to an art form also made authentic self-expression nearly impossible. The same moral framework that unified society across class boundaries also perpetuated inequalities that condemned millions to lives of struggle and subordination. Yet, as you drift towards sleep, consider the profound human capacity for adaptation that the Victorian story reveals. Faced with the unprecedented disruptions of industrialization, urbanization, and social change, an entire civilization created new ways of living together, new standards for appropriate behavior, new mechanisms for maintaining community in an increasingly fragmented world. Their solution may appear strange to us now, but it represented a genuine attempt to preserve human dignity and social connection in the face of forces that threatened to atomize society into isolated, competing individuals. The Victorian achievement was to demonstrate that social behavior could be learned, practiced, and perfected, that people were not condemned to repeat the crude patterns of earlier ages, but could consciously choose to elevate their interactions, refine their sensibilities, and create beauty even in the mundane activities of daily life. The price they paid for this achievement was the surrender of much individual freedom, but the benefit they gained was the creation of a shared culture that could bridge differences of class, region, and circumstance. Their world has vanished now, swept away by two world wars, social revolutions, and changing ideas about human nature and social organization. The elaborate rituals of calling and visiting have given way to casual telephone conversations and electronic messages. The complex hierarchies of precedence have been replaced by more egalitarian forms of social interaction. The careful choreography of formal dining has yielded to informal gatherings where comfort matters more than protocol. Yet something valuable has been lost in this transformation. The Victorian commitment to excellence in social performance, their belief that how one behaved mattered as much as what one achieved, their confidence that proper education could improve human character. These ideas seem almost quaint now, but they represented a serious attempt to address questions that remain relevant. How should people treat each other? What standards should govern social interaction? How can individual desire be balanced against collective need? The Victorians answered these questions in ways that now seem both admirable and troubling. Their emphasis on courtesy, consideration for others, and attention to detail created interactions marked by genuine grace and dignity. But their rigid hierarchies, gender restrictions, and class prejudices also created suffering for those who could not or would not conform to prescribed patterns of behavior. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Victorian experience is the recognition that all social rules, including our own, represent choices rather than natural laws. The elaborate etiquette that governed Victorian life was not inevitable but constructed, not eternal but historically specific, not universal but particular to the needs and anxieties of a specific time and place. Understanding this should make us both more sympathetic to the Victorians' solutions and more conscious of our own assumptions about appropriate behavior. As you settle into sleep, let the rhythm of that vanished world carry you gently forward, the measured pace of formal visits, the careful cadence of proper conversation, the quiet satisfaction of duties fulfilled and standards maintained. There was something deeply human in the Victorian desire to transform daily life into art, to elevate ordinary interactions through conscious attention to form and beauty, to believe that individual effort towards self-improvement could contribute to the betterment of society as a whole. Their world may have been constraining, but it was not empty. Their rules may have been elaborate, but they were not meaningless. Their society may have been hierarchical, but it was not heartless. Within the boundaries of Victorian propriety, people found love, friendship, purpose, and meaning. They raised families, built communities, created art, and contributed to human knowledge and welfare. They lived full human lives within the framework of their time, just as we live full human lives within the framework of ours. The story of Victorian social rules reminds us that human beings are social creatures who cannot exist as isolated individuals, but must always find ways to live together, to establish common standards, to create shared meanings that make collective life possible. Every society must develop its own solutions to these fundamental challenges, its own balance between individual freedom and social order, its own mechanisms for teaching appropriate behavior and maintaining community standards. The Victorians chose elaborate formality, careful hierarchy, and constant attention to propriety as their solutions. We have chosen different paths, emphasizing individual expression, social equality, and personal authenticity. Neither approach is perfect, and both involve trade-offs between competing values. The Victorian emphasis on social harmony came at the cost of individual freedom. Our emphasis on personal liberty sometimes comes at the cost of social cohesion, but there is comfort in recognizing that the fundamental human challenges remain constant, even as the specific solutions change. The Victorian struggle to balance personal desire with social expectation continues in different forms today. Their anxiety about maintaining respectability finds echoes in our concerns about professional reputation and social media presence. Their elaborate rituals of courtesy and consideration anticipate our own efforts to create inclusive, respectful communities. As the Victorian world fades into the gentle darkness of historical memory, let it carry with it not judgment of their limitations, but appreciation for their efforts. Not condemnation of their failures, but recognition of their genuine attempts to solve problems that every human society must address. They were people like ourselves, trying to live meaningful lives within the constraints and possibilities of their time, seeking connection with others while maintaining personal dignity, hoping that their efforts toward improvement might contribute to a better world for future generations. Rest now in the knowledge that the urgent social anxieties that kept our Victorian ancestors awake, the fear of social disgrace, the constant calculation of appropriate behavior, the exhausting performance of respectability need not trouble your sleep. You live in a different world, with different rules, different freedoms, and different constraints. The particular burdens that weighed upon Victorian shoulders have been lifted, even as new challenges have taken their place. Let the story of their elaborate social world serve not as a source of anxiety, but as a gentle reminder of human adaptability, social creativity, and the endless capacity for people to create meaning and beauty, even within the most constraining circumstances. Their legacy lives on not in the specific rules they followed, but in their demonstration that conscious attention to how we treat each other can elevate human interaction from mere transaction to genuine art. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of the same human story that included the Victorians, the same ongoing effort to create societies where people can live together with dignity, purpose, and care for one another. Their chapter in that story has closed, but yours continues, shaped by their experience, but not bound by their limitations, learning from their achievements while avoiding their mistakes, carrying forward their best impulses while adapting them to the needs and possibilities of your own time. The elaborate world of Victorian social rules has dissolved into history, but the human needs it attempted to serve remain eternal: the desire to belong, the hope for acceptance, the longing for a life marked by grace, beauty, and connection with others. These desires will find new expressions in every generation, new rules and customs and traditions that serve the same fundamental purposes while reflecting the unique circumstances of each historical moment. Rest peacefully in your own time, your own place, your own freedom from the particular constraints that shaped Victorian life, while carrying with you an appreciation for their efforts and a recognition of the continuing human work of creating societies where people can flourish together. The Victorian story is ended, but the human story continues, and you are part of it, contributing your own chapter to the endless book of human social creation and adaptation. Let sleep carry you gently away from the weight of historical performance, away from the anxiety of constant social calculation, into the quiet comfort of your own present moment, where you can simply be yourself without the elaborate armor of Victorian propriety, free to dream of whatever worlds your imagination might create.